is really good to be together on Zoom and in the room. We see many of your faces. Some people have your cameras off, and I know that this is going to be. Oh, thank you. Yeah, because he got it.
Yeah.
I know this is going to be an interactive conversation, so if you're comfortable keeping your camera on and want to be a part of this with us, we would invite you to. So I'll just say, first of all, that, sorry, we need to get our stuff set up, and then we'll be ready.
Oh, I thought it'd be nice to have it up there.
Oh, you want to?
That way we can see what other people are saying.
Oh, the chat. I just didn't want to have it in speaker mode. I just want to have,
Okay.
I'll put the chat back up when we have that, but I wanted to see everyone's faces. I learned somewhere along the line that in polite society, you're not supposed to talk about religion, politics, and sex. So of course I went into the rabbinate where you're actually obligated to talk about religion. Then I became a rabbi at Beth where you're obligated to talk about politics. And this morning we decided that we would talk about sex. So we've now done the trifecta. And I think that we as Jews know, and I think that Noam's book speaks to this so well, that expression doesn't really fit what it means to be an engaged Jewish person. That a Judaism that's so small that can't talk about politics or sex or, God forbid, talk about God, is not a Judaism that most of us aspire to. We want Judaism to think and to inform all of these parts of our life. So that's why I'm so grateful for Noam Sachs Zion and for his book, because it is not a short book, and it takes you through a hundreds of years old halachic debate about what does Judaism need to say about marital intimacy. My wife and I have been reading this book in different sections of these books separately and talking about it together. And we've been reflecting on your question, Noam. My wife grew up at a Beth day school, and she learned about sex and intimacy in a certain way that was different than I learned at the Ohev Shalom Hebrew School in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. And we've been talking about the ways in which that shaped our, the way that we look at the world, the way that we look at our relationship. But what we agree on is what Noam starts his book with, that we find the Shekhinah, we find God in that space between us, and in the way our relationship, that a relationship that has sanctified sex actually has space for that. So we're just so excited, Noam, to learn from you today. You asked me, and I'm not going to say your bio, but I'll just say that you have deep ties to our congregation. One is that we, through your uncle and aunt, and also that you've taught in our space a number of times at big events. We hope that we'll be able to have an event that big again in the future and welcome you back. But with that, I'll just say it's great to have you. We're going to learn for about an hour and then have some time for questions. And that's all I'll say. Thank you, Noam.
Great. Thank you very much, Rav Tyler. And it's very nice to be back at Beth. At least my voice is back in Beth. And one of my greatest memories is meeting Louis Kaplan at Beth in the old days and having doing 3 presentations with Tom Hall together with his choir up in the main sanctuary. It was an incredible experience, the greatest teaching experience of my life, that's for sure. Now, if the question I put in the chat as a warm-up was how you learned about sexual intimacy, I'll simply say that my father, Moshe Sachs, who grew up in Baltimore, what he did when I was about 12 and a half, 13, he didn't want to talk about it, so he simply took me to a shelf in which he had 30 books by psychologists and all kinds of people about sex and about adolescence. He says, read whatever you want. And that was the sum total of my sex education. Luckily, for my children, I married a woman who was a Lamaze teacher, and she did a very good job, that I can promise you, getting into all the details in a lovely kind of a way. Now, the book I produced is a book really about marital intimacy. It's not specifically a book about about divorce or marriage, or even about gender questions like heterosexual marriage versus homosexual marriage, or gay marriages, or trans. There are lots of other people who've written about those topics very well, and I didn't want to repeat that. So I thought I would deal with the issue of the relationship. We know relationships are complicated, and clearly the sexual intimacy, the relationship within a committed love relationship, whether it's people living together with commitment or people living together with commitment and marriage, is always a complicated matter. And I sort of took it upon myself to see what could I derive, what positive forms of models and advice I could get out of rabbinic tradition. with an appropriate caveat. You all know, none of you are so naive as to think that everything in Judaism about marital intimacy is good. There are very, very dark chapters, and we'll touch on them very briefly. If you haven't seen the movie Unorthodox about Satmar Hasidim, I'm sure you could get a good idea. So the question is, how do you derive from a tradition which is mixed, but more important than mixed, has a deep debate between people who believe that sanctity, religion, spirituality means that we have to distance ourselves from our bodies and from sexuality. You have procreation, but you don't have to get into the sexual pleasure aspect. And a totally different view of sanctity that says, as Rav Tyler mentioned, the notion is that specifically in sexual emotional intimacy, that's when God's presence comes down and it's embodied within our families, within our world. And then actually those are two radically different notions of spirituality. As a result of the debate between these two over 2,000 years, you begin to get a richer and richer notion of the positive value of intimacy, thanks to the people who have a richer and more extreme version of why you should never mix sexuality with spirituality. And so out of that dialogue, let's see what we can learn. I'm going to share with you the texts, and we'll start with a picture of Chagall. I'll expand this. I'll make it the right size for you. Okay, so here's the cover itself. A picture by Marc Chagall I'd never seen before called The Kiss. Definitely intimate and therefore appropriate for a debate on marital intimacy. Now, if you ask me why I was interested in doing such a book, I think in some ways it goes back to this famous text. It's a text that says if you want to learn about marital intimacy, the only way to do it is to become a voyeur, to go into a rabbinic bedroom, to see how they're doing it, to see what they talk about, and that's how you learn. That is, a lot of teaching goes under a lecture or under a sermon. Those are nice words, sometimes create a beautiful picture, sometimes motivate us. But the real test of learning Torah is embodied Torah. When you see a human being living a good life, an ethical life, a spiritual life, and you ask yourselves, how do they handle difficulties and challenges in their life? In other words, we're going to have to go into the bedroom, and this is the famous story about a student, an audacious student, a chutzpahdik student named Kahana, who got under his teacher Rav's bed while Rav was making love with his wife. So it wasn't like putting a camera in there, as we know about people putting cameras in mikvahs and in other private spaces, but rather he was able to overhear what their conversation was, as well as the many noises that go with making love. So here's the story, and here's what sort of gives me the mandate for doing this book. Rav Kahana, before he was a Rav, when he was still Kahana, went in under Rav's bed. This is Babylonia, 1800 years ago. He heard him chatting and jesting. The Hebrew is sort of rhymes together, sach v'sachak, talking, conversing, and also laughing or joking. So it might be translated playing or laughing or engaging in foreplay and gratifying his needs. Kahana said to him, "It seems as if the mouth of Abba is both the first name of his teacher Rav, but also the name of honoring somebody who called them an abbot or an Abba or a father. That's a sign of respect. It seems as if the mouth of Abba, my teacher, had never before tasted that dish." Now, I don't like the word dish very much, but when I was growing up in the area long before PC conversations, when you talked about a woman and you said she was a dish, that was a compliment. It meant that you're using a culinary image for her beauty, for her being delectable, for her being delicious. Clearly a problematic term I think we're very aware of today, but that's the language he's using. It's a very gross language to use of your teacher and the teacher's relationship with his spouse. Rav replied, I think quite appropriately, "Kahana, are you there? Get out. For it is not the way of the world. It is not good manners, derech eretz, for you to be under my bed in this situation. Clearly, Rav was interested in privacy, to maintain his own dignity, his wife's dignity, so on, and yet his student had a good comeback. Kahana answered, "This too is Torah, and to learn I must." So I'm going to take that as my mandate. The mandate is, it is Torah to learn about lovemaking and marital relationships, even though that involves an element of invading privacy, and to a certain extent it involves asking people to share their more personal experiences, at least with their children, but also with one another, both between the spouses and perhaps more broadly, to clarify how do you learn the art, the practice, the culture of the discipline of lovemaking. In other words, I'm assuming that it's not enough to have a physiological urge and then you're going to learn how to do it because the nature, the instinct will overcome you. And animals don't have to go to class. Why should an individual who's a human being? And yet here the notion is nature is not enough. We need culture. We need civilized lovemaking. We need to build a relationship, and it ultimately achieves sanctity. So it's not enough just to say, I don't have to learn it, because otherwise you will learn it other ways, like from pornographic movies, from romantic movies, but not mediated through somebody who's thinking about them. So I love that story of Kahana, but I hate Kahana. Because while Rav is the father, the rabbinic father of a whole tradition that has a very positive mandate for conversation and for jesting and for sexual satisfaction with your spouse, Kahana is the father of a view that says the opposite. It says, how could a teacher who's a rabbi be treating his sexual relationship as if it was a culinary event? How could he get so excited about it? Where's his rationality? Where's my teacher's spirituality? Where is my teacher's... He's a veteran husband. How could he get so excited? He's not some adolescent and it's the first time he's hooking up. All of those are ways of putting down the whole nature, and to say that the higher aspiration of religion and of Judaism in specific has to be to transcend the instinctual, transcend body, transcend the culinary in general, and therefore basically sex shouldn't be very interesting. After all, you have Torah, so why would you need sex to arouse you? And so it's that debate which I'm really interested in. I'm really happy with this picture I got on the internet of this peeping Tom. Although he's not peeping, he's just listening, but he's bugging the room. And now I thought I would tell you about how I got to this topic from me personally. And here I would have to go back, it's a long time ago, when I was a virgin. That is when I went off to Columbia University back in 1966. And was as naive as you could possibly be about all of those issues. Even though I went through high school, that wasn't the place in which I was initiated. And I arrived at a Columbia that was still very, very conservative, that we were told you cannot, Columbia was an all-male school, you can't have a co-ed in your room unless the door is left open. Then there was a halachic discussion about how open it had to be. The answer was the size of a matchbook. Not so much, but it's still very clear that there was an attempt to control these matters very strongly. And yet, by the following year, I was living in the middle of the American sexual revolution. It wasn't just about greater freedom in terms of people's sexual relations. Promiscuity in one kind or another has been with us forever. However, it became a revolution because now we as students, that is all the people we could trust who were under 30, were making the claim that the values we were taught by bourgeois society, by our suburban Judaism, by traditional religion, whether Christianity or Judaism, were actually forms of oppression. And that we had nothing to learn from American society because American society, all those adults over 30, were deeply implicated in the racism of America, the civil rights movement, and deeply involved in the Vietnam movement. And so it became a period of people looking to find their wisdom not from their parents, not from Western civilization, but from many non-Western civilizations. That's the period, of course, that many people got into meditation in the Far East. But this is also the period of an enormous Jewish renaissance, which some of you may remember directly. The period of the Chavurah movement, of the Jewish catalog, which some of you may still have within your homes at some place. And the idea was we can go back to Eastern Europe for Hasidism, we can go back to traditional Judaism and find wisdom which will help to make up for the fact that we have nothing to learn, as we claimed, from Western civilization and so on. And yet, in this period of a search for a revival of Judaism, the Jewish catalog had articles about how to build your own sukkah, how to make your own challah, how to do Jewish dance, how to study Hasidism, how to study mysticism. It was a chance to go back and reclaim those traditions to meet contemporary needs. But in the area of sexual ethics, in the area of gender, the founder really of the Chavurah, one of them, Art Green, Rabbi Arthur Green, himself a conservative rabbi, he said the following things. He said, we have nothing to learn about the art of lovemaking and relationships from Jewish tradition. And this is how he explained it. The Jewish catalog is a reflection of the neo-traditional Jewish lifestyle that is evolving among certain young in spirit American Jews, I include you in the young in spirit, in Chavurot, alternative communities. While these circles have tended toward traditionalism, we are postmodern rather than pre-modern Jews, and our lifestyle is hardly to be considered halachic. It is in the areas of sexual relations and the place of women that this discrepancy between a fully halachic traditionalism and the neo-traditionalism of these new Jews is most clearly seen. We need a new halacha and a new Haggadah, a new religious ideal rationale, which we will not find within traditional Judaism. So that sort of began to push me and say, well, is there really nothing I can learn? And in fact, Art Green never went ahead to continue this topic. He's written a lot of wonderful things, but not on these topics whatsoever. And then the co-founder of the Chavurah, a fellow who was quite unusual, a student of from Chabad. His name is Reb Zalman, or Reb Zalman Schechter Shalomi. Here's a picture of him with the Dalai Lama. And he wrote also about the same issues. He said, look, when I grew up in the Haredi world, in the Chabad Hasidic world, when I was a student in yeshiva, I remember thinking of sexuality as that lousy trick that God played on us. How could God do such a terrible thing as to implant in us an urge that is so difficult to resist, and yet I'm expected to resist it? I would even get bad thoughts, that is, thoughts about erotic thoughts, from looking at ads for the Maidenform bras that were in the subway. So on one hand, this was a period in the 60s and 70s in which there was a strong critique in this area of traditional Judaism. The question is, what do we replace it with? And here there was a deep ambivalence about the American sexual revolution, which promised it all liberation. For example, Rabbi Herschel Matt, whose son is the main translator and editor of the Zohar in English, the sexual revolution, says Matt in the Jewish catalog, has increased our knowledge, our awareness, our frankness, and decreased many of our fears. That's good. And yet, in spite of all the good in the sexual revolution, there is much that is bad. Now, what is that bad? We'll let Art Green explain it. We Jews should stand opposed to the current moves toward the demystification of sexuality, which seek to define coupling as a purely biological function. In other words, once the American sexual revolution said that there's no place for religion, and in fact there's no place for ethics within the marital relations, within the sexual relations, it's merely a biological need like the need to eat and the need for exercise, and therefore as long as we find a partner who's willing, it's a private matter. And Art Green says, no, why are we demystifying sexuality? We are made most fully human by the fact that this act shared by us with the animal kingdom. It is what makes us animals, but can be raised in our consciousness to the rung of the sublime mystery of union. In other words, we have to not deny our natural needs, but rather we have to integrate them into a higher spiritual relationship in which the I-thou, as Martin Buber put it, and he was very popular in that period, how do you form an I-thou of true emotional intimacy and relationship within the sexual relationship in which you're also driven by instincts that can easily overcome you? That was the challenge. So, what I'd like to do first is, and I'll stop and if anybody have questions, I'm happy to take questions also during the presentation. The first question becomes, what do we need when it comes to a Jewish sexual ethics? And I ask that question even though, in a very clear way, I do not want to see God or your rabbi or the Supreme Court or the state legislatures intervening in the private realm of my relationship with my spouse. That I definitely do not want. On the other hand, it seems to me that there is an area in which we do want public interference in terms of sexual relationships, and that's related, of course, and been emphasized by the Me Too movement. That is precisely because sexuality exposes our vulnerability and our needs. It also exposes us to abuse. The very fact that in interpersonal relationships are relationships that always have an asymmetry to them. Whatever the legal equality between the two members of the sexual relationship, there's also power relationships involved, and they invite, therefore, the danger of exploitation and mainly of shaming. So the first reason I would go back to halakha is halakha is something that's binding. In all kinds of other areas having to do with sexuality, all the book I'm dealing with is advice, wisdom literature, resources that I might use in order to live a higher quality of relational life. But in this specific area, I'm interested, yes, in establishing an ethics that should be enforceable one way or another in order to protect people from damaging and hurting and abusing one another. So here I'm going to go back to the very first law in the Torah that talks about relationships between husband and wife. And it's a text which is not at all egalitarian. This is a text about polygamy, where the man can have more than one wife and the wife can only have one husband. And here's the law. It's one of the first laws after the Ten Commandments in Sefer Shemot. A husband should treat his wife in accord with the law of married women, mishpat abanot. So if he marries an additional wife, that's his advantage, he must not deprive his first wife of three things: she'era, ksuta, and onata. I'll explain them in a minute. If he does not provide these three, she exits the marriage. So here we have the first law that tells us that what a husband owes to his wife, we have nothing about what the wife owes to the husband, and we have the right of a woman to a divorce so that she can find a relationship in which she can have her basic needs and desires satisfied. That's the fundamental principle. Both the man, but certainly both the man and the women have rights and needs from a marriage. But the law only intervenes to protect the weaker person, in this case, the woman. It doesn't establish equality, but it does allow somebody to exit a situation which is painfully asymmetric. Now here's how Rashi explains those three terms based on the Talmud. She'erak sutan onata are her food, her clothing, and her sexual intercourse. So the first understanding of what sexuality is it's a need. It's a biological need like food is, like clothing is. And the husband's job, the husband having the economic resources, because he has that asymmetry, it's his obligation to take care of her needs. Since the woman is not allowed to have an extra husband on the side, Therefore, the husband has to make sure that he's providing especially sexual intercourse, because if she looks for that outside of the marriage, that's called adultery. If he looks for it outside of the marriage, it's called a second wife. Again, the asymmetry. So he's establishing not only do we have needs, sexual needs, he's establishing that women have sexual needs, and he's saying that in the contract between a husband and a wife, she has rights, and if she doesn't get her rights, she can exit the marriage, and she can go and find somebody who is able to do that. Now, the Ramban, 13th century, he adds a different turn altogether. He's not only interested in the question of, does she get sexual intercourse? How often does she get it? Which is a conversation in the Talmud. They set literally the quantity of intercourse. Ramban is interested in the quality of the relationship. Therefore, he sets me on my task, which is to talk about qualitative quality time between spouses. She'erah, he says. She'erah is a term for flesh, like flesh and blood relative. It recalls Adam and Eve, who became one flesh in the garden, one family. But it may also mean that she may not be deprived of the touch of flesh of her husband. He's not to follow the Persian custom of having intercourse in his clothes. This is a strange notion. What it says is, and this is the halakha, this is the law, that if either the husband or the wife says, I'll have sex with you, but only if I can keep my clothes on, that's grounds for divorce. In other words, besides intercourse itself, there is a physical touching. There's a warmth and intimacy which doesn't have to do with sex or orgasm. It has to do with touching. And the Persians, the rabbis lived in Persia, said, we're not going to be like the Persians who always have sex only in clothes because they want to separate between the spiritual and the physical. No. And if you think about it, I mean, if a child is left in an incubator for too long, or a child goes to an orphanage in which there isn't a warm staff, then very often those children will fail to thrive, because physical touch is part of this intimacy that all human beings need, especially in the case of spouses. So that's number one. Number two, ksut, is her bedclothes. But he's not talking about clothes in general. It's her linens. She must be wooed in her bed in an honorable fashion, not on the floor like a prostitute. In other words, one of the things the husband has to invest in is creating a beautiful bedroom. That's part of the scenery that turns this into a dignified interaction between them, not just, let's get rid of our sexual needs any way we can, like animals would, or like when you're paying for a prostitute would. Therefore, I understand a good reason that my wife likes her favorite store in America, if it still exists, is Bed, Bath, and Beyond. And so spending money on that bedroom is part of the dignity of showing I really care. You have to be wooed. She has to be wooed in her bed. It's not just, it's time for you to do what you owe me. Not at all. I have to woo you. And the third one, Ona, is her times of lovemaking, a phrase taken from the Song of Songs, regularly scheduled, even if a second wife is taken. In other words, lovemaking, just as we sometimes talk about food security, knowing where your next meal comes from, so a human being who's in a committed love relationship has to know when their times of lovemaking are come. As long as they know, then they have love security, like food security. And the last quote I want on the ethics of sexual relationships, that is, an area that should be protected by law, is Maimonides. And he says, a husband shall not coerce her into intercourse against her will, that is rape, but rather seek her consent as the outcome of conversation, sicha, and joy, simcha, similar to what we learned about Rav in his bedroom. Notice Maimonides is saying, you probably know that in British and American law, up until 1970, a husband could not be accused of an act called rape within marriage. There was no such thing. Rape is against your will. But within a marriage, the husband and the wife, legally speaking, were one unit, an organic unit. The husband was the head of the unit, and the woman had agreed to get married freely. Didn't that mean she also agreed to sex whenever he wanted it? That was changed in 1970, but a similar principle is found in Maimonides and in the Talmud that says that it's not a matter of rights, it has to be a matter of wooing. It's true that we've created a structure in which the man and the man has obligations to the women, but the nature of the relationship should be one based on consent. And the consent has to be given anew every single time they approach one another. And it has to be achieved through that joyful, arousing, cementing of and fixing of the emotional relationship. The rabbis said you should always begin to appease your spouse by dealing with all of the issues you have between them. If two people are angry at each other, or one of them is angry at the other one, then you can't begin to approach sexuality until you work out that relationship. And those conversations are mandated. And then you have to not only make sure that you're not angry at one another or vengeful or frustrated, you also have to make sure that there's a joy, that you've aroused desire. All right? So that's sort of the basic ethical structure around which Jewish ethics is really based, Jewish sexual ethics. What I'm going to look at now is I'm going to jump to the 20th century. The mid-20th century, and take a look at a great debate happening within the ultra-Orthodox world between two different attitudes toward marriage. Are there any questions or comments somebody would like to make? Here, Rav Tyler, you're the master of ceremonies, maybe one or two questions.
Yeah, I need to go to gallery mode so I can see. Maybe someone can raise their hand and Alex can actually call because he has the screen. We really enjoyed the text. I really enjoyed the text from the Mishnah about Onah that talked about that the times of Onah vary based on your profession. So if you were a seafarer and you were going to go out for a long time, that it seemed to have some a realistic that if you were away for a long time, but it still said you couldn't have any profession where you could go away for such a long time. That was one thing that I thought was really interesting. And I think the other piece that is just striking me, and I'm curious how you explain this, Noam, is it seems like they're pushing against an idea that we haven't made explicit that maybe the only commandment in the Torah around sex is to be fruitful and multiply. And that it seems like they're saying you might have thought that if the person cannot procreate anymore, then there's no rules around sex, and maybe either they don't need to have it or they shouldn't have it, because then it's just about desire. It's not about like this other purpose. And I guess that seems to be really important in this. I'm curious, are they elevating that in a certain way through this law, or am I missing? Is there another commandment that I'm missing?
No, I think you've read it absolutely correctly. There is the commandment to have children is an independent commandment, and it has nothing to do with the man's obligation to his wife's emotional and sexual needs. And therefore, those sexual needs apply whether or not they're in a period, whether she's pregnant or not, or whether it's after menopause. That doesn't matter at all. The obligation is for the emotional and the sexual intimacy all the way along. And as you probably know, Rav Tyler, that if the husband wants to change professions, and let's say he has an easy profession, he's a bureaucrat or he's a teacher, and therefore he's available every night, then the obligation for intercourse is every single night. However, if that teacher decides they want to upgrade and become a congregational rabbi, and therefore we know they're going to be very busy on weekends and tired and lots of late night meetings, and therefore maybe once a week is probably all he will have time for, then the wife can say, no, I object to your changing your profession. So basically, once you enter into the relationship, the woman knows what your profession is. She has agreed to accept you in that situation. Any changes, including moving to a new place or changing jobs, then she has a power to veto it. Let's jump.
I love that text because I think it's it's so important it reminds us that it's a continual negotiation. You can't say, oh, well, we signed the ketubah, and that means that this is like that the couple needs to continually be negotiating as they make changes and moving in jobs, in all of these things. I think it's so relevant. Are there any other hands up or anything? No.
Now, I'm going to jump to the ultra-Orthodox world, a very surprising place, and show you something that was most surprising to me, a great debate between two groups of ultra-Orthodox in the 1950s. One side were the Gur Hasidim, and the other one were the Litvaks, that is those Jews from Lithuania who put a big emphasis on yeshiva and studying. They couldn't be blacker, but there are 50 shades of black. And here's what we'll see the opposite. On the side of the Hasidim, which is what the movie Unorthodox represents, Satmar, what we see is their attitude is that marriage has nothing to do with friendship. There's a wonderful memoir by Shulam Din, who himself grew up as a member of a very extreme Hasidic group called Nu Skver, the Skvera Hasidim. And when he was 18 and he was engaged, then his groom instructor quoted the Talmud. And the Talmud said something very positive. One should love his wife as much as himself and respect her even more than himself. But the instructor said, but he explained, how do we understand this passage? What it really means, esteemed young men, is that we must be vigilant. Respect what she, a woman, can do to a man. If he does not remain careful, let down your guard, and she will lead you into Sheol Tachlis, into the abyss of sinful temptation in hell. Because the women will arouse you sexually, you won't be able to control yourselves, and therefore respect means beware of your wife. And then on the day right before the marriage, in fact the afternoon before the evening marriage, finally they gave him a class on the mechanics of how to perform sex. My wedding day arrived, and I was to learn the mechanics of how to perform the mitzvah. Before the act itself, Reb Shraga said, lie beside her, chat for a few minutes. Chat about what? I asked, right? These are men who have never had a conversation with a woman, and vice versa. Doesn't matter, the teacher said. Any tale about a righteous man. Then you get on top, of course on top. Most important of all, the mitzvah must be done the way it was done by the great sage Rabbi Eliezer. We didn't go into his bedroom, but in his bedroom he had sex in the middle of the night as quickly as possible, as if a demon were forcing him to have it, and he took off almost none of his clothes. Mazel tov, he said. If there are any problems, call me. So in the Hasidic world, we can see that it's not only that they are trying to limit the sexuality, they're trying to limit all emotional relationships between a husband and a wife. They shouldn't see themselves as friends. They should see his friends are his yeshiva students. The woman is an enabler for him. And the most extreme version of that is the Gur Hasidim, who in 1948 established that you should have intercourse no more than once a month, that every couple had a mashgiach, a private supervisor, and whatever questions they had about what intimacy was permitted, they had to get permission from that supervisor. They were never allowed to call each other by their first names, never allowed to walk on the street together, to go in an elevator together, to sit in an airplane together. They wanted to minimize emotional intimacy during the whole marriage, not just at the moment of intercourse itself. Now it's against that extreme, that dark, dark picture of Hasidism that we discover an incredible revolution that happens in 1951 from the person I would least likely to name as a person that I would expect to learn something about marital intimacy from. His nickname was the Chazon Ish. He died in 1952. He was really the founder of ultra-Orthodoxy in Israel, the man who forced Ben-Gurion to give an exemption to all yeshiva students, who prevented the draft of religious women. He's anti-feminist, anti-egalitarian, anti-Western, anti-Zionist, anti-everything I can think of. And yet, in reaction to the Hasidim, he invented a whole new understanding of what Judaism has to say about marital intimacy. How did he do that? He did it by quoting a law in the Torah that says the following, a law that nobody pays much attention to. It's an obligation to devote a year to make his wife happy. Of course, the language is skewed toward talking to the men because he didn't talk to the women. And this is a letter he sent to all of his yeshiva students who were married. When a man takes a new wife, he shall not go out with the army. He shall be exempt, free to be at his home for 1 year. For what purpose? And to make his wife, whom he took, happy. Now, happy is not about sex anymore. Happy is about an emotional state. And it's not about what you do in the bedroom. It's the whole relationship for a whole year has to be devoted to making your spouse emotionally happy. So now he has to step into a field he doesn't know much about, and that is, tell us something about female psychology. So I apologize to all the women who probably are sick of having men tell them what they need. But it's quite interesting what he projected on the women. And in this sense, I would say that he's a follower of the very famous book, The Difference Between Men Are From Mars and Women Are From Venus, that they have essentially two different natures and attitudes, one more interested in sex, one more interested in relationship and love. So this is what he wrote. It is her nature to find joy in the way she finds favor in her husband's eyes, and her eyes are directed to him expectantly. Therefore, he must make an effort to show her love and closeness in words of conversation and appeasement. Basically, he's saying something that Carol Gilligan says as well, that is that women in our society are much more interested in relationships, in networking. And part of it is that the woman's happiness will depend on feeling that she's loved and appreciated by her husband. And therefore, it's certainly not enough just to worry about sexual orgasm, which he doesn't even talk about here. What's really important is to make sure that she feels valued, that she feels loved. And to do that, he says something quite interesting, and I really like this. He says he should tell his wife whenever he leaves the house where he's going. And upon his return, tell her what he has done and other little things and words of reinforcement to make her heart happy. I would say the invention of things like WhatsApp and perhaps Twitter, which I don't use, are precisely designed for that. How many young people do you know that every single moment, every single thing they do, there's a photograph, there's a note, they send it to everybody's got to know exactly what they feel and what they're doing. And he's saying that's what the husband has to develop with his wife so she knows that he's thinking about her when he's not there. And when he comes back, he's going to enter into a conversation. And therefore, he exempted people from a very draconian rabbinic tradition that says that one should not have too much conversation with one's wife. And he well, when it comes to this first year, you should have lots of conversation because how else do you know what this other human being needs? And he said that the purpose of all of this is a higher purpose. In the first year, one must make an effort to achieve unity, which is the Creator's intention, as it says, to become one flesh, and for Shekhinah to dwell between them, as Rav Tyler already mentioned. He's saying we shouldn't look at the relationship between man and woman just as a matter of satisfying each other's physical needs, or just a matter of maintaining shalom bayit, some domestic tranquility. This has a higher goal, and the higher goal is the unification of the whole world, beginning with the unification between the male and female, or between the two partners in their difference. And then he says, sometimes treating one's spouse with respect and with awe of politeness displays lack of intimacy. In other words, it's not enough just to be respectful, which is important. One must relate with greater intimacy than can be accommodated in a relationship of respectful honor. In other words, following Rav, levity and lightheadedness are more lovable than seriousness and awesome honor. I cannot imagine this ultra-Orthodox rabbi is being involved in levity and lightheartedness, but that's precisely what he's demanding here, even if it means lowering the standards of politeness and maintaining respect and distance. And that's it. That's his point. Now, his students, he wrote this 4-paragraph letter in 1951, sent it to his students. But a generation later, in 2003 and so on, today the most popular books in an ultra-Orthodox bookstore, a bookstore especially for Lithuanian, for yeshiva students, are many, 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 many books about husband and wife relationships. And here's how this notion of having a conversation, where did I go, where am I coming from, what happened today, turns into a much deeper notion of what marital communication should be about. This is his teacher, Rav Moshe Shachatovitz. Actually, I'm going to go a little bit further. He says the following. The Torah established that the only way for a person to be complete and not a mere half is to be united as a man and a woman in marriage. We are not in the image of God as an individual. We are only in the image of God in a relationship. Very striking idea. So much of what Western society is about is the autonomy of the individual, the self-sufficiency of the individual, to satisfy yourself. Im enani li mili, who am I if I'm not for myself? And yet he's saying you're not fully human until the man and woman or the partners come together, and then precisely the complementarity of their difference is united into a greater whole. That whole is called a human being. That whole is in the image of God. So what does that mean practically? So during their whole lives lived in mutuality, each must learn about the other half. I mean, you know that, of course, in the ultra-Orthodox world, everything is about learning. Learning from a book. But now your spouse becomes the book. A spoken book, an oral Torah. And you have to learn from your spouse how they see the world, and you have to let your spouse know how you see the world. The result will be a whole human being. A person who has both a male and female perspective on the whole of creation. However, what happens in reality, and he knows that, of course, the ultra-Orthodox world is not really living up to that standard. What happens in reality, instead of a man learning the female perspective on the creation, he insists stubbornly that he remain in his narrow male perspective even after marriage, and he misses the main purpose of marriage, right? Because the purpose of marriage is to achieve that greater wholeness that comes from learning both the male and the female side of reality. And that's why he goes on to say that the first year is a full year of work to become acquainted with the other side of the coin. It's not just about romance, it's about learning. And in fact, he says most people, they can't do it in a year. It could take 5 years, it could take longer, it doesn't matter. Continue to communicate, because until you come to understand that fuller view, and then your partner will be, then your spouse will be your marital, covenantal partner. Right? Now that's one whole direction in the ultra-Orthodox world that totally surprised me. Let me give you one other part, and then we'll see what kind of questions there are. There was a second friend of the Chazon Ish, equally black, a Litvak, a follower of the Musar movement, if you may have heard of it within the United States. Rav Isaac Sher is his name. And he wrote a 30-page letter, not 4 paragraphs, to his yeshiva students who were married. And he asked them to read this letter together with their wives every month. And this is what he had to say. The following 3 important things. Number 1, desire itself is sanctified from its impurity when it brings them, spouses, together to become one flesh. Throughout Jewish tradition, the general approach to desire is it's dangerous, it's anarchic, it leads to exploitation, it leads to sin, it leads to adultery. And he's saying, no, you don't understand. The Jewish people is such a holy people that they can transform desire into sanctity when they're using that desire in order to bring together the man and woman. The more desire, the more glue between the two of them. We need to teach people more desire. And then he says, how important is this desire? Sexual desire? It's as important as the act of prayer and sacrifice. And the fire of desire between man and woman is similar to the fire on the altar over which the Shekhinah dwells. And then he admits that in the Haredi world we have a lot to learn. The virtue of love is not properly developed among us, the Haredim, the ultra-Orthodox. Parents and teachers who truly painfully worry about the happiness of their seed ought to teach their children and students the mitzvah of igniting the flame of love and preparing nature, that is bodily desire. For the core of sanctity is their union, which can only come about through powerful love between them so that they become one in body and soul. He has to correct Judaism, which has a strong tendency toward asceticism and downgrading desire and emphasizing mastery of desire and conquest of desire. We need not only to conquer it, but we need to arouse it. Right? And then he says, let me tell you how to do it. Because as a Mussernik, he's interested in techniques. The beginning of the Musser movement, by the way, is in a book that I read when I was in high school, a book called Benjamin Franklin's Autobiography, in which he talks about how he could shape his character to become a better and better human being. That book was translated into Yiddish, and it became the basis of the Musser movement and the use of rational techniques to reshape our character. In this case, Rav Sher wants to use those techniques, beginning with Ben Franklin, and apply them how we strengthen the loving desire between a couple. You might call this marriage sustainability as opposed to environmental sustainability. How do you keep a marriage alive in the sense of people really desiring each other, coming together, and reaching a high level of union? You have to work on it every single month. And this is what he said. Every month, one becomes a newlywed again. One should learn from the case of Rav that it's a mitzvah to act lightheadedly with one's wife exactly as she wishes, as if he were a bridegroom just emerging from the wedding canopy, who had never had intercourse in his life. He's basically taking what Kahana said as a rebuke to Rav, and he said, what? You're treating this woman as this is the first time you ever had a dish? What are you doing? You should be used to this. You should be beyond this. And he's saying, God forbid, says Rav Sher, every month we should feel as if it's the first time. She wants him to behave that way so that she too will feel like a bride at the moment of her wedding. And that is the way they should behave their whole lives. As it says, Song of Songs, I am to my beloved, and my beloved is to me. That's radical. Because in the Talmud, the Song of Songs is only understood metaphorically as a description of the love between God and Israel. It's never applied to human relations. And here, he's totally unafraid to deal with the mundane meaning of the Song of Songs, which is an incredibly erotic book of mutual praise. In fact, he says, I'm going to skip. He says, a couple should be wise to keep a notebook from their wedding celebration and to record all the words of love and compliments they spoke to one another as loving companions from each day and night of the 7 days of their marital festivities. They should reread them on a monthly basis. Next technique, and the last one we'll mention, is guided imagery. Have you ever done guided imagery? So imagination, like desire, is typically in rabbinic tradition, as in philosophic tradition, is considered a source of desire, a source of evil, a source of yetzer hara, of the evil inclination, imagining things. Generally, historically, up until the 19th century, the imagination was considered something negative that takes us away from rationality. But here, in the 20th century, Sher says imagination is our greatest technique for maintaining the sustainability of love. The rabbis say that God planted in the heart of Adam and Eve feelings of love and beauty. Then the Holy One, like the best man, the Shushbin who arranges the wedding, braided her hair, brought her to Adam. He and she were happy with her beauty. Even today, at every wedding, the Holy One is the true Shushbin, making the couple happy. Therefore, the couple must imagine themselves in the Garden of Eden. Then the woman is filled with love and pleasure arising from sanctity and spiritual elevation, so that when she reaches the apex of the act of intercourse, she is fully intoxicated, hovering in the world of imagination. Then she dreams pleasant dreams illustrated with beautiful images of angels filled with light and radiance flying above her, feeding her with very same pleasures as in the Garden of Eden itself. So too the man can in this desire, in this act, and with this woman be filled with elevated thoughts and elevated illustrations of love and sanctity in their sexual and emotional unification. Comments, questions at this point before I put on an ending?
Can you take off the text so we can see each other over the Zoom?
Great idea.
Thanks. So Noam, what is your what's the prescription? So you take us to Reverend Young's church where they had a sex experiment where they asked couples to be intimate every day for a week and report back. I don't know if Betham's ready for a sex experiment. And yet you're saying something that, even in non-Haredi communities, and maybe we should, use this literature to legislate in some way to inform. Something that is probably the most personal part of our lives. So what is your prescription for us?
Well, I think it's built on three levels. The first level was the one I spent the most time in, and that is the time on the sexual ethics. That is setting clear standards for how we maintain dignity and recognize each other's needs and rights and protect ourselves both from being exploited and also from being ignored. That's step number one. And that's an ethics that has to be taught, certainly from the young, for teenagers, especially for teenagers who are not likely to wait with their sexual experiences until we presume them to be mature. Though, of course, we have that strange thing called adult movies, as if to be an adult is the opposite of being mature and self-controlled. The second thing is to view loving and a loving relationship as an art to be learned and developed and practiced. And I think that what I like about halakha is like a self-help book. Halakha is concerned with the details of how you do it, not just with the preaching about the values. And I think the more we get down to the concrete things of how do you show love, emotional and erotic as well, the more we'll be able to actually improve the relationship. And I think since we learn best not from sermons, but we learn from people, maybe we have to have people who are honest enough to talk about their relationship in a respectful, loving manner. Maybe we need to take excerpts from the best movies we know that show us a sense of what we mean by a positive relationship. And maybe also ones that show a negative relationship. But we have to get as concrete as possible in order to help that issue. And the third point is, I think that we need, as we put tikkun olam on our agenda, and we put Jewish observance and Jewish holidays on our agenda, I think we have to take the interpersonal relationships, instead of treating them as purely private, we need to put them on our agenda for education. If the Haredim can do it, why can't we? Why is it that rabbis very seldom talk about these areas? And in fact, rabbis, in many ways, although they used to play a very big role in terms of a pastoral role for helping couples dealing with their problems. My father was a conservative rabbi and also a PhD in therapy. I know there's been a tendency over time, more and more, to shift that off to the psychologist and the therapist, who are not talking necessarily from a value point of view, and certainly not from a Jewish point of view. I think we should be mandating this as one of the important callings, not the only calling, an important calling of liberal American Judaism, to say our job is to improve the quality of ahavta l'reacha kamocha, the quality of loving your neighbor, not only the stranger, but also loving your family. Because I think we're living in a period in which the strains on the family are so great that families, any kind of living together relationship, requires a lot of support, because we live far away from our adult children, because there's so many people divorced. So we need to strengthen those emotional forms of intimacy between people, especially people who are committed love relationships, but in general. We should make the shaping of our character so we can give and care and love both in the most intimate way and to people who are not involved directly in. We have to be able to do that and see it as a very high value. If we start with the interpersonal, then we'll have to maximize the real change, not changing people's opinions or just their voting patterns or just the letters they write to their congressman, but their actual interpersonal relationships within the synagogue, within the family. That's the area I think we have to work on a great deal and realize that that is actually a great contribution to the redemption of the world.
Thank you, Noam. Are there other questions? Someone can unmute and share. Or reactions.
Yes, Carla.
I think that just voicing the issue is a way to encourage conversation within couples in the way that they see fit. Just legitimizing it, just as your father found it was easier to put books out than to talk to you directly. And in my situation, there was a lot more comfort, so that the books were there to back up the conversations. It's going to happen in different places in different ways. Not everybody wants to post their entire life every moment, but
Right.
Most people want to share some things, and who you choose to share it with, if you just frame the conversation. That's why your presentation is so lovely, because it puts it forward and allows it to be in spaces that may not bring it up before.
Very interesting. You know that there's the tradition of reading Pirkei Avot at 6 chapters between like Pesach and Shavuot. So it might be an interesting idea to talk about a period in which we would send home to each member of the shul a text, a story, and some questions, and encourage them on Friday night when they're having dinner together, not to give a Dvar Torah, but to have a conversation about in reaction to the text. Let the text be out there first. In other words, maybe there's some homework we need to do. In the text that I hope they shared with you, there's a whole section on Orthodox photographers who work with women in the Orthodox world to prepare boudoir albums as gifts to their husband. And the photographer talks beautifully about the notion that we need to educate within the Orthodox world that your body is good, that a love relationship, that eros is something sacred, and we need to help these women to be willing to get into a very sexy lingerie and to have photographs, and then to give it as a gift to their husbands. Just it's not the kind of album you want on your shelf, but maybe you want it under your bed or under your pillow. And I was so amazed again about this group of people who are working hard to open themselves up in new kinds of ways. And I think doing that kind of homework could be a really wonderful thing. I could certainly use it, I'll tell you that. Shall I show you a final photograph?
Please.
Okay. So this actually fits perfectly with the way you opened the talk, Rav Tyler. Right? This is a picture from the article about the boudoir, right? And here is one of my favorite pictures. This is from my teacher, Alav Shalom Menachem Fruman, who I studied with him all day on the day my wife and I got married. The two of us sat and we studied Maimonides' laws having to do with marriage, marital responsibilities. Later on, he went to settle in the West Bank. He was a West Bank settler, but he was an unusual West Bank settler because he used to conduct interfaith dialogue with the right-wing Qadis and Imams of the Hamas movement.
Wow.
He said, only people who truly love this land as a holy land, that is, Orthodox Jews like himself and Imams like them, could really have an honest and fruitful discussion from a religious point of view about their relationship to the land. So often you can imagine that photographers would come and they would love to interview him, always made for a good article. And at the end of the article, very often the journalist, this is a story I heard, would say, Menachem, could we take a photograph of you for the picture? He said, only if my wife is in the picture. So he and his wife Hadassah, who's a wonderful woman who's continued his work after he passed away. And Menachem said to the photographer, now I want you to focus. I want you to focus right in the middle between me and my wife. I want you to take a photograph of God. The Shekhinah, the divine presence, should be between the two of us, between a loving couple. So take a photograph of God and put it in your newspaper. And that idea, I think, is just a wonderful one. Looking for the presence of God in the midst of interpersonal relationships, emotional and erotic ones. I think that's a very high value that ought to be encouraged. And that would be my answer to the American sexual revolution.
Noam, I want to thank you so much. I was thinking about that picture during shul this week when we were studying about the construction of the Mishkan and these two cherubim, these two angels that are fixed, and what's happening in between them is a place for Shekhinah. I think that picture could be called Mishkan or Parshat Truma as well. I think it's such a beautiful picture. I just want to thank you for the I feel like you've given us a challenge today. You've given us a task to continue this conversation in our community and in our families. So you've given us a little bit of a burden, but I think it's a good burden for us to carry. So thank you so much for presenting and for bringing this topic, which is not spoken about very much in the non-Orthodox world, to us and to the Jewish community. And I think that we will be much better for it. And thank you everyone for joining us on Zoom and in the room. And I imagine this will not be the last conversation we have about these topics at Beth in the short term. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Regards from
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Forgot.